The evening of September 14th, 1956, was warm and humid in Harlem, with temperatures still in the mid-70s at 7 o'clock, despite the sun having set an hour earlier. The sidewalks along Lenox Avenue were crowded with people finishing their Friday routines, workers heading home from jobs, families going out for dinner, couples walking to evening entertainment at clubs and restaurants that were beginning to open for the night. Mayme Johnson was 42 years old in September 1956 and had been married to Bumpy Johnson for 8 years. Mayme was walking north on Lenox Avenue between 131st and 132nd Streets, returning home from visiting a friend who lived several blocks south. Mayme wore a dark blue dress with a pearl necklace and matching earrings, clothing appropriate for an early autumn evening in Harlem. Mayme walked with the confident bearing of someone who knew she was respected in the neighborhood and who had never experienced public disrespect during her years in Harlem. At approximately 7:15, as Mayme approached the corner of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street, a black Cadillac sedan pulled to the curb directly in front of her. The car was new and expensive, with chrome details that gleamed under the streetlights. The driver remained in the vehicle while a man emerged from the rear passenger door. The man was approximately 50 years old, white, with graying hair and expensive clothing, a gray suit that likely cost several $100s, leather shoes that had been recently polished, and a gold watch visible on his left wrist. The man stepped onto the sidewalk and then turned to look directly at Mayme as she approached. The man's gaze moved slowly from Mayme's face down to her feet and then back up, a deliberate visual inspection that took several seconds. Then the man winked at Mayme with exaggerated slowness, his right eye closing and opening while a slight smile appeared on his face. The gesture was unmistakable in its intent. It conveyed that this man considered Mayme to be someone he could treat with casual disrespect, someone whose dignity was subject to his whims, someone who existed for his amusement. Approximately 15 people were on that section of sidewalk, close enough to observe the interaction. Several people stopped walking when they saw what was happening. The man's wink and smile were visible to everyone nearby. Mayme's expression did not change. Mayme did not stop walking, did not slow her pace, did not look directly at the man, and did not acknowledge his gesture in any way. Mayme simply continued walking past the man and the Cadillac and proceeded north on Lenox Avenue toward her home several blocks away. The man watched Mayme walk past him, apparently surprised that his gesture had not provoked any visible reaction. The man then turned, got back into the rear seat of the Cadillac, and the car pulled away from the curb and continued north on Lenox Avenue. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 15 seconds. But those 15 seconds had been witnessed by multiple people who knew exactly who Mayme Johnson was and who understood that what they had just observed represented a significant violation of neighborhood norms. Several of the witnesses knew that this information would reach Bumpy Johnson very quickly. Mayme continued home and did not mention the incident to anyone that evening. Mayme understood that the neighborhood had eyes, and that if the incident mattered, Bumpy would learn about it through his own networks. Mayme's role was simply to continue with dignity, and to allow the systems that protected her to function as they were designed to function. By 9 o'clock that evening, less than 2 hours after the incident, Bumpy Johnson had received 3 separate reports about what had happened on Lenox Avenue. The first report came from Calvin Brooks, a numbers runner who had been standing outside a barber shop on 132nd Street and who had witnessed the entire interaction. The second report came from Eleanor Thompson, a woman who had been walking with her daughter and who knew Mayme from church. The third report came from Samuel Foster, who operated a newsstand on Lenox Avenue and who had seen the white man in the expensive suit emerge from the Cadillac and wink at Mayme Johnson. All three reports were consistent. A white man in an expensive gray suit had emerged from a black Cadillac, had stared at Mayme in a deliberately disrespectful manner, had winked at her, and had smiled while doing so. The interaction had occurred in full view of multiple witnesses on a busy sidewalk on a Friday evening. Mayme had not responded, but had simply continued walking with her dignity intact. Johnson was 50 years old in September 1956 and had spent 26 years operating in Harlem's criminal economy since arriving from Charleston, South Carolina in 1919. Johnson had learned through decades of experience that immediate emotional reactions to disrespect typically produced temporary satisfaction but permanent problems. Violence in response to insults created cycles of retaliation that were costly and dangerous. Public confrontations drew law enforcement attention that complicated operations. Impulsive responses demonstrated that provocations could be used to manipulate behavior. What was required instead was patience, investigation, strategic thinking, and systematic action that addressed not just the individual who had shown disrespect, but the broader context that had made such disrespect possible. The white man who had winked at Mayme had done so because he felt entitled to treat a black woman with casual contempt, regardless of her social position. That sense of entitlement derived from social structures that permitted white men to disrespect black women without consequences. Changing the individual's behavior required changing his understanding of what consequences his actions would produce. Johnson spent the 3 days following the incident, September 15th through September 17th, gathering information about the white man who had disrespected Mayme. This investigation required resources and contacts that Johnson had built over 26 years in Harlem. By September 18th, Johnson had assembled a comprehensive profile. The man's name was Robert Sterling. Sterling was 52 years old and lived in a townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, valued at approximately $75,000. Sterling was the owner and president of Sterling Properties Corporation, a real estate company that owned 18 buildings in Harlem with a total of approximately 240 apartment units. Sterling's business model involved purchasing older buildings at below-market prices, conducting minimal maintenance to keep expenses low, and charging rents that generated approximately 35% profit margins. Sterling's annual income from these properties was estimated at $60,000, a substantial sum in 1956 that placed Sterling in the upper tier of New York's business class. Sterling lived entirely outside Harlem. His home was on East 68th Street, his social life centered in white neighborhoods on Manhattan's Upper East Side. His business office was in Midtown, and his only contact with Harlem was through his property manager, who collected rents and dealt with tenant complaints. Sterling visited his Harlem properties approximately once monthly, arriving by car with his driver, spending 30 to 45 minutes reviewing finances with his property manager, and then leaving. Sterling's Friday evening visit to Harlem on September 14th had been one of these routine visits, and Sterling had been returning to his car after meeting with his property manager when he encountered Mayme on Lenox Avenue. Sterling's business depended on multiple interconnected systems that were each vulnerable to disruption. Sterling needed tenants who paid rent regularly. Sterling needed suppliers who provided maintenance services and materials. Sterling needed banks that provided financing for property purchases and operational expenses. Sterling needed city inspectors who would not enforce building codes too strictly. Sterling needed insurance companies willing to provide coverage. Sterling needed a reputation as a legitimate businessman rather than a slumlord. Each of these systems could be affected by targeted pressure. Johnson understood that destroying Sterling's business would require patience, coordination, and sustained effort over weeks or months. The response needed to be systematic rather than dramatic, cumulative rather than singular, and complete rather than symbolic. Sterling needed to understand that his casual disrespect toward Mayme Johnson on a Harlem sidewalk had triggered consequences that would dismantle his entire business operation and social position. Between September 18th and September 25th, Johnson built a coalition of people who would each play specific roles in creating pressure on Sterling's business. This coalition building required Johnson to leverage relationships he had developed over decades and to explain clearly why each person's participation mattered. The first critical ally was Thomas Wright, who was 55 years old and who led the Harlem Tenants Association, an organization representing approximately 4,000 families living in rental housing throughout Harlem. Wright had worked with Johnson on previous occasions when landlords had attempted to evict families who could not pay rent, and Wright understood that Johnson's interventions often protected vulnerable tenants. Johnson met with Wright on September 18th and explained that Sterling Properties owned 18 buildings in Harlem and that Sterling's treatment of tenants and maintenance of properties was poor. Johnson stated that Sterling had also publicly disrespected a prominent Harlem woman and that this disrespect reflected Sterling's broader contempt for the Harlem community. Johnson asked Wright to mobilize the Tenants Association to put pressure on Sterling's properties through rent strikes and tenant organizing. Wright agreed to participate because the Tenants Association had been looking for opportunities to challenge exploitative landlords and because Sterling's poor property maintenance made his buildings good targets for organizing campaigns. Wright understood that successful rent strikes against Sterling could demonstrate the association's power and could improve conditions for hundreds of families. The second ally was Samuel Harrison, who was 48 years old and who owned Harrison Building Supplies, a company that provided maintenance materials and services to property owners throughout Harlem. Sterling Properties purchased approximately $12,000 worth of materials and services annually from Harrison Building Supplies, representing about 8% of Harrison's total business. Johnson met with Harrison on September 19th and explained that Sterling had disrespected a woman in the community and that various pressures would be applied to Sterling's business operations. Johnson asked Harrison to refuse to sell materials or provide services to Sterling Properties going forward. Harrison hesitated because losing Sterling's business would create a significant revenue shortfall. And Johnson addressed this concern by stating that he would arrange for Harrison to receive business from other property owners to offset the loss of Sterling's purchases, and that the short-term revenue loss would be compensated by long-term business relationships with owners who respected the Harlem community. Harrison agreed to participate. The third ally was Margaret Foster, who was 62 years old and who served on the board of Community Savings Bank, a Harlem-based financial institution that held mortgages on 4 of Sterling's properties, totaling approximately $45,000. Johnson met with Foster on September 20th and explained that Sterling had disrespected a prominent community member and that various forms of pressure would be applied to Sterling's operations. Johnson asked Foster to use her influence at the bank to ensure that Sterling's loan applications for future property purchases would be denied and that the bank would consider calling Sterling's existing loans if Sterling fell behind on any payments. Foster agreed because Community Savings Bank was committed to supporting Harlem's development, and because Sterling's business practices of buying properties cheaply and maintaining them poorly was contrary to the community's interests. Foster understood that using the bank's financial leverage to pressure Sterling could send a message to other outside investors that exploitation would not be tolerated. The fourth ally was James Patterson, who was 45 years old and who worked as a building inspector for New York City's Department of Housing. Patterson had grown up in Harlem and maintained connections to the neighborhood despite working for the city government. Johnson met with Patterson on September 21st and explained that Sterling Properties owned 18 buildings in Harlem and that these buildings likely had numerous building code violations related to inadequate maintenance. Johnson asked Patterson to conduct thorough inspections of Sterling's properties and to issue citations for any violations discovered. Patterson agreed because building inspectors generally had broad discretion about which properties to inspect and how strictly to enforce code requirements, and because Patterson believed that landlords who exploited Harlem residents should face consequences. Patterson understood that comprehensive inspections of Sterling's properties would likely reveal numerous violations that would require costly repairs. The fifth ally was Helen Richards, who was 53 years old and who wrote a weekly column for the Amsterdam News, Harlem's primary newspaper, with circulation of approximately 45,000 readers. Johnson met with Richards on September 22nd and explained that Sterling Properties was a slum landlord that owned 18 buildings in Harlem, charged high rents, provided minimal maintenance, and that Sterling had recently publicly disrespected a prominent Harlem woman. Johnson asked Richards to write about Sterling's business practices and to expose the exploitation of Harlem tenants by outside property owners. Richards agreed because investigative journalism about housing exploitation was directly relevant to her readers and because exposing slumlords served the public interest. Richards understood that newspaper coverage would create reputational damage for Sterling and would support tenant organizing efforts. The sixth ally was Reverend John Wilson, who was 58 years old and who led Grace Baptist Church, one of Harlem's largest congregations with approximately 800 families. Johnson met with Wilson on September 23rd and explained that Sterling Properties exploited Harlem residents through poor housing conditions, and that Sterling had disrespected a community member. Johnson asked Wilson to speak from the pulpit about housing exploitation and to encourage church members who were Sterling's tenants to participate in rent strikes and organizing efforts. Wilson agreed because churches had historically played central roles in community organizing, and because addressing housing exploitation was consistent with religious principles of justice and dignity. Wilson understood that mobilizing church members could significantly strengthen tenant organizing efforts. These 6 allies represented different forms of power: tenant organizing, supplier relationships, financial leverage, government enforcement, media exposure, and religious authority. Each ally had independent reasons to participate beyond simply helping Johnson respond to Sterling's disrespect. Each ally understood that their participation would produce benefits for themselves, their organizations, and the broader Harlem community. The coalition was built on mutual interests rather than personal favors. Between September 25th and October 15th, a period of 3 weeks, this coalition implemented a comprehensive strategy designed to create cumulative pressure on Sterling's business from multiple directions simultaneously. The strategy had 7 components that would operate concurrently. The first component was tenant organizing and rent strikes. Thomas Wright and the Harlem Tenants Association began organizing tenants in Sterling's 18 buildings starting September 25th. Organizers went door to door, explaining that Sterling was exploiting tenants through poor maintenance and high rents, and that tenants had legal rights to withhold rent when landlords failed to maintain properties properly, and that collective action would be more effective than individual complaints. By October 1st, tenant organizations had formed in 12 of Sterling's 18 buildings, and approximately 130 families had agreed to participate in rent strikes beginning October 1st. These families placed their October rent payments into escrow accounts rather than paying Sterling directly, reducing Sterling's monthly rental income by approximately $4,000. The second component was supplier disruption. Samuel Harrison informed Sterling's property manager on September 26th that Harrison Building Supplies would no longer sell materials or provide services to Sterling Properties. When the property manager asked why, Harrison simply stated that the company was refocusing on other clients. The property manager attempted to find alternative suppliers, but Johnson had also spoken with 3 other major suppliers in Harlem, and all had agreed to refuse Sterling's business. Sterling was forced to source materials and services from companies outside Harlem at significantly higher costs and with longer delivery times. The third component was financial pressure. Margaret Foster spoke with Community Savings Bank's Loan Committee in early October and raised concerns about Sterling's properties, tenant complaints about maintenance, potential building code violations, and declining rental income due to tenant organizing. The committee decided to deny Sterling's pending loan application for purchase of 2 additional properties and to send Sterling a letter stating that the bank would review all of Sterling's existing loans if he fell more than 30 days behind on any payments. Sterling received this letter on October 8th. The fourth component was building code enforcement. James Patterson conducted comprehensive inspections of all 18 of Sterling's properties between September 28th and October 10th. Patterson found numerous violations in each building: inadequate heating systems, electrical hazards, water damage, structural problems, pest infestations, and fire safety deficiencies. Patterson issued citations totaling approximately $28,000 in required repairs across all properties. Sterling received these citations throughout early October. The fifth component was media exposure. Helen Richards published a column in the Amsterdam News on October 5th titled, "Who Profits from Harlem's Housing Crisis?" The column detailed Sterling's business model of buying properties cheaply, maintaining them minimally, and extracting maximum rents from tenants. The column included interviews with several of Sterling's tenants describing poor living conditions, broken heating systems in winter, leaking roofs, rodent infestations, and unresponsive management. The column noted that Sterling lived on the Upper East Side in a $75,000 townhouse while collecting $60,000 annually from Harlem tenants living in deteriorating conditions. The column called Sterling a textbook slumlord whose exploitation of Harlem families represents exactly the kind of extractive outside ownership that perpetuates poverty in our community. The sixth component was religious mobilization. Reverend Wilson preached a sermon on October 7th about economic justice and housing exploitation, stating that landlords who failed to maintain properties while charging high rents were violating moral principles. Wilson specifically mentioned that some landlords lived in luxury outside Harlem while collecting rents from families living in substandard conditions. Wilson encouraged church members facing housing problems to contact the Tenants Association for support. Approximately 60 families from Grace Baptist Church were tenants in Sterling's buildings, and Wilson's sermon strengthened their participation in organizing efforts. The seventh component was social pressure within Sterling's own networks. Johnson arranged for information about Sterling's business practices to reach several of Sterling's social contacts on the Upper East Side. A lawyer who belonged to Sterling's social club received documents detailing building code violations in Sterling's properties. A business associate received a copy of Helen Richards's Amsterdam News column. Sterling's neighbors on East 68th Street found copies of the Amsterdam News article in their mailboxes. The purpose was not to cause direct harm, but to make Sterling aware that his reputation in his own social circles was being affected by his business practices in Harlem. And these 7 components operated simultaneously throughout late September and early October. Each component created problems for Sterling's business that required time, money, and attention to address. More importantly, the problems were interconnected and reinforcing. Tenant organizing reduced rental income, which made it harder to pay for building code repairs, which created more tenant complaints, which strengthened organizing efforts, which attracted more media attention, which created more social pressure, which made Sterling's situation progressively worse. By October 15th, 1 month after Sterling had winked at Mayme Johnson on Lenox Avenue, Sterling's business was experiencing severe stress. Monthly rental income had declined by approximately $4,000 due to rent strikes, and required building code repairs totaled $28,000. Material and service costs had increased by approximately 30% due to supplier disruption. The bank had denied his loan application and threatened to review existing loans. Media coverage had damaged his reputation. Social contacts were asking uncomfortable questions. Sterling's property manager was overwhelmed dealing with tenant organizing, building inspections, and media inquiries. Sterling attempted several responses to these pressures, but each response failed to stop the deterioration of his situation. Sterling hired lawyers to pursue evictions against rent-striking tenants, but the lawyers informed him that judges were generally sympathetic to tenants who withheld rent due to poor maintenance and that eviction proceedings would be slow and expensive. Sterling attempted to find new suppliers, but companies outside Harlem charged higher prices, and many were reluctant to work with a landlord who had been characterized as a slumlord in newspaper coverage. Sterling tried to delay building code repairs, but the city threatened daily fines if violations were not corrected within 60 days. Sterling attempted to sell several properties to raise cash for repairs, but prospective buyers were discouraged by tenant organizing, building code violations, and negative media coverage. By late October, Sterling understood that he was losing control of his business and that the problems he faced had begun on September 14th, when he had winked at a woman on Lenox Avenue. Sterling had not known who the woman was at the time, had not known that she was married to Bumpy Johnson, and had not understood that his casual gesture of disrespect would trigger systematic pressure that would threaten to destroy everything he had built over 2 decades. On October 28th, Sterling made a decision that reflected his desperation. Sterling instructed his driver to take him to Harlem, not to visit his properties, but to attempt to contact Bumpy Johnson. Sterling understood that all the pressures he faced, tenant organizing, supplier disruption, financial problems, building inspections, media coverage, were connected, and that the connection point was Johnson's response to Sterling's disrespect toward his wife. Sterling spent October 28th and October 29th attempting to find someone who could arrange a meeting with Johnson. Sterling spoke with several business owners and community figures, and explaining that he needed to speak with Johnson about resolving problems affecting his properties. Most people refused to help, unwilling to facilitate contact for someone who had been publicly identified as a slumlord and who had disrespected a prominent community member. Finally, on October 30th, Sterling found someone willing to carry a message that Robert Sterling requested a meeting with Bumpy Johnson to discuss resolution of their conflict. Johnson agreed to meet with Sterling on November 2nd at an office above a restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Sterling arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, accompanied only by his driver, who waited outside. Sterling was shown to an office where Johnson sat at a desk reviewing papers. Sterling began speaking immediately, and stating that his business was being destroyed by coordinated pressure that he believed Johnson had organized, that Sterling had not intended any serious disrespect when he had winked at a woman on the street 6 weeks earlier, that Sterling understood he had made a mistake, and that Sterling wanted to discuss how to resolve the situation. Johnson listened without interrupting. When Sterling finished talking, Johnson stated several things clearly. First, the woman Sterling had disrespected was Johnson's wife, and Sterling's gesture had been witnessed by multiple people and had occurred on a public sidewalk in Harlem. Second, Sterling's gesture reflected Sterling's general contempt for Harlem residents, which was also evident in Sterling's business practices of extracting maximum rents while providing minimal maintenance. Third, the pressures Sterling was experiencing were responses from tenants, suppliers, financial institutions, government inspectors, media, and religious institutions, each acting according to their own interests and principles. Fourth, Johnson had not ordered violence against Sterling, had not destroyed Sterling's property, and had not harmed Sterling's family. Johnson had simply helped various community institutions understand that Sterling's presence in Harlem was unwelcome. Sterling asked what he needed to do to stop the pressure. Johnson stated that Sterling had two options. The first option was to continue fighting, to continue pursuing evictions, to continue searching for alternative suppliers, to continue trying to delay building code repairs, to continue operating his business in Harlem. This option would require years of expensive legal battles, continued negative media coverage, and permanent conflict with tenant organizations, and would likely result in Sterling eventually selling his properties at distressed prices or losing them to foreclosure. The second option was to sell all 18 properties immediately to buyers who would maintain them properly and treat tenants fairly. Johnson stated that he could arrange for buyers to purchase all 18 properties at fair market values that reflected current income minus required repairs. Sterling would receive enough money to pay off his mortgages and retain perhaps $20,000 in profit, far less than the properties would have been worth without all the problems, but enough to allow Sterling to exit Harlem with his immediate financial survival intact. Sterling asked for time to consider the options. Johnson stated that Sterling could think about it, but that the pressures would continue until Sterling either sold the properties or was forced out through foreclosure or sale at distressed prices. Johnson stated that every day Sterling delayed would cost money in legal fees, repair expenses, and lost rental income. Sterling sat quietly for approximately 2 minutes. Sterling had entered the meeting believing he could negotiate some kind of compromise that would allow him to retain his properties and continue his business. Sterling now understood that no such compromise was available. Sterling's only choice was whether to leave voluntarily with some money or to be forced out with nothing. And Sterling stated that he would sell all 18 properties and that he wanted Johnson to arrange the sales. Sterling asked that the sales be completed quickly so that the financial drain on his business would stop. Johnson stated that the sales would be arranged within 4 weeks and that Sterling would receive payment upon transfer of deeds. Johnson stated also that Sterling should never return to Harlem except to complete the property sales, should never disrespect any woman in Harlem again, and should understand that his situation could have been far worse if Johnson had chosen violence instead of systematic pressure. Sterling agreed to all conditions. Sterling stood, shook Johnson's hand with visible reluctance, and left the office. Sterling understood that he had entered the meeting as a successful businessman with properties worth more than $200,000, and had left the meeting having agreed to sell everything and leave Harlem permanently. Sterling understood that the cost of winking at Bumpy Johnson's wife had been the destruction of his business and his forced retreat from an entire neighborhood. Between November 3rd and November 30th, Johnson arranged for the sale of all 18 of Sterling's properties to buyers who committed to maintaining the buildings properly and treating tenants fairly. Some buildings were purchased by tenant cooperatives that Johnson helped finance. Other buildings were purchased by black property owners based in Harlem who understood that maintaining good relationships with tenants was essential to successful business. And all sales were completed by November 30th as Johnson had promised. Sterling received approximately $23,000 after all mortgages were paid and sales expenses were deducted. Sterling had invested more than 15 years building his real estate portfolio in Harlem and had extracted hundreds of thousands of dollars in rents from tenants. Sterling left Harlem in November 1956 with less money than he had started with and with his reputation damaged. Sterling never returned to Harlem and never purchased property in the neighborhood again. The resolution of Robert Sterling's situation created effects that extended far beyond one slumlord's forced departure. The demonstration that a wealthy white businessman who disrespected Bumpy Johnson's wife would face systematic pressure that destroyed his business sent a clear message throughout Harlem about respect and consequences. The demonstration also showed outside investors that exploitative business practices in Harlem would face organized resistance that could destroy profitability. The tenant organizing that had begun in Sterling's buildings continued after the properties were sold. The Harlem Tenants Association gained approximately 300 new member families from the organizing campaign, strengthening the organization's capacity for future actions. Several tenants who had participated in rent strikes became tenant organizers themselves, building institutional capacity for housing advocacy. And the Building Code Enforcement campaign against Sterling's properties set a precedent that city inspectors could and should enforce standards strictly when landlords failed to maintain properties. James Patterson continued conducting thorough inspections of properties where tenant complaints indicated poor maintenance, and other inspectors followed this example. The enforcement culture shifted toward greater accountability for landlords. The media coverage by Helen Richards in the Amsterdam News established a pattern for investigative reporting on housing exploitation. Richards wrote several follow-up articles about other slumlords in Harlem, and this coverage helped inform tenants about their rights and helped mobilize support for housing reforms. The journalism served the public interest while also generating readership for the newspaper. The financial pressure from Community Savings Bank demonstrated that local financial institutions could use their leverage to support community interests rather than enabling exploitation. The bank's willingness to deny loans to Sterling and to threaten loan reviews sent a signal to other outside investors that financing would not be automatic for exploitative business practices. The coalition that had organized to pressure Sterling remained intact and available for future actions. Thomas Wright, Samuel Harrison, Margaret Foster, James Patterson, Helen Richards, and Reverend Wilson all understood that their coordination had been effective and that similar coordination could address other community problems. The success created institutional memory and relationships that strengthened Harlem's capacity for collective action. For Mayme Johnson personally, the response to Sterling's disrespect confirmed that her dignity was protected not just by her husband's individual power, but by community institutions that valued respect and that would mobilize to defend community members from disrespect. Mayme continued living in Harlem with the security that came from understanding that public insults would face consequences. For Bumpy Johnson's reputation, the handling of Sterling's disrespect reinforced perceptions that Johnson's power derived from strategic thinking and institutional leverage rather than impulsive violence. Johnson had responded to a personal insult by organizing a coalition that included tenants, suppliers, financial institutions, government inspectors, media, and religious leaders, each acting according to their own interests but coordinated to achieve a common goal. The response had been comprehensive, sustained, and effective. Sterling had not been physically harmed, but had been reduced from a wealthy businessman to a defeated man pleading for terms of surrender. The metaphorical image of Sterling on his knees, begging for resolution, captured the essential truth. Systematic pressure, wielded through institutions, was more devastating than any violent retaliation could have been. The case illustrated principles that characterized Johnson's most sophisticated operations. The response to disrespect had been strategic rather than emotional. Johnson had waited days to investigate Sterling's background, identify vulnerabilities, and build a coalition before taking any action. The action had been systematic rather than singular, 7 different forms of pressure operating simultaneously over 6 weeks. The pressure had been institutional rather than personal, tenants organizing according to their own interests, suppliers making business decisions, banks protecting their investments, inspectors enforcing codes, journalists serving readers, clergy mobilizing congregations. Johnson had facilitated and coordinated these actions, but had not needed to threaten or coerce any participants. The victory had been comprehensive. Sterling had not just been punished, but had been removed from Harlem entirely. The properties had been transferred to owners who would maintain them properly. The tenants had gained stronger organizational capacity. The institutions had strengthened their ability to coordinate. The precedent had been established for future actions. Most importantly, the entire response had occurred within legal frameworks. No violence had occurred, no property had been destroyed, no laws had been broken. Tenant organizing was legal. Supplier decisions were business choices. Bank loan decisions were financial judgments. Building inspections enforced legitimate codes. Newspaper coverage was protected journalism. Church mobilization was free expression. Every component of the response had operated through legitimate channels, making the victory not only effective, but also defensible. And the story of how Robert Sterling had casually winked at Mayme Johnson on a Harlem sidewalk, and how that gesture had cost Sterling his business and forced his retreat from the neighborhood, became one of many narratives that circulated about Johnson's protection of family and community dignity. The story emphasized the systematic nature of the response, the coalition building, the coordination of multiple pressure points, the sustained effort over weeks, the comprehensive victory, and the lesson that disrespect toward women connected to Johnson would trigger consequences that destroyed livelihoods. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Johnson understood power and consequences. Disrespect in public required public responses that demonstrated clearly to everyone watching what happened when boundaries were violated. Those responses should be systematic rather than impulsive, institutional rather than personal, sustained rather than momentary, and comprehensive rather than partial. Real victories were measured not by dramatic violent retaliation, but by whether the person who showed disrespect was reduced to begging for mercy, whether their power was systematically dismantled, whether they were forced to retreat in defeat, and whether the precedent established deterred future violations. The legacy extended beyond Sterling's individual case. The precedent that white businessmen who disrespected black women in Harlem would face systematic community resistance influenced how other outside investors approached their business practices in the neighborhood. The demonstration that tenant organizing, supplier coordination, financial pressure, building code enforcement, media coverage, and religious mobilization could be combined to destroy exploitative businesses provided a model for future community actions. The protection of Mayme's dignity maintained social norms about respect that benefited all women in the community. These outcomes required no celebration or exaggeration to demonstrate their value. A wealthy man was reduced to pleading for terms. A business was destroyed. Properties were transferred to responsible owners. Tenants gained protections. Community institutions were strengthened. A precedent was established. The legacy endured. The 18 properties that had been owned by Sterling Properties and that were sold in November 1956 remained in operation under new ownership for decades afterward. Several of the buildings that were purchased by tenant cooperatives continued operating under tenant management through the 1970s and 1980s, providing stable, affordable housing for families. The buildings that were purchased by Harlem-based property owners generally maintained better standards than they had under Sterling's ownership. The transfer of these properties from exploitative outside ownership to responsible community ownership contributed to housing stability in Harlem during a period when many neighborhoods experienced significant deterioration. Robert Sterling lived until 1979, dying at age 75 from natural causes. Sterling never returned to real estate investment in Harlem and never rebuilt the business empire he had lost in 1956. People who knew Sterling in his later years reported that he remained bitter about having been forced out of Harlem, but that he never spoke publicly about the details of what had happened or about why his business had collapsed so rapidly. Thomas Wright continued leading the Harlem Tenants Association until his death in 1968, organizing successful campaigns against several other slumlords and helping to establish stronger tenant protections. The association credited its success in the Sterling campaign as a turning point that demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated tenant action. Margaret Foster served on the board of Community Savings Bank until 1972, continuing to advocate for the bank to use its financial leverage to support community development rather than exploitation. The bank's policies about scrutinizing loans to outside investors became more rigorous following the Sterling case. James Patterson continued working as a building inspector until his retirement in 1975, maintaining a reputation for thorough enforcement of building codes and for taking tenant complaints seriously. Patterson credited the Sterling case with showing him that building inspectors could play important roles in protecting communities from exploitation. Helen Richards continued writing for the Amsterdam News until 1969, publishing hundreds of articles exposing housing exploitation, police misconduct, employment discrimination, and other injustices. Richards won several journalism awards for her investigative reporting on housing conditions in Harlem. Reverend Wilson led Grace Baptist Church until his death in 1971, continuing to preach about social justice and economic fairness, and continuing to mobilize church members to participate in community organizing efforts. Wilson credited the church's participation in the Sterling campaign with demonstrating that religious institutions could effectively support community action. The office above the restaurant on Lenox Avenue, where Bumpy Johnson met with Robert Sterling on November 2nd, 1956, and where Sterling agreed to sell all his properties and leave Harlem, remained in use as Johnson's office location until Johnson's death in 1968. The office became known informally in Harlem as the place where people who violated community norms were forced to face consequences and to accept defeat. The quiet power of the intervention, organizing a coalition, implementing 7 forms of pressure simultaneously, sustaining effort for 6 weeks, forcing Sterling to plead for resolution, removing Sterling from Harlem entirely, transferring properties to responsible ownership, stood in contrast to dramatic narratives that often characterized stories about powerful figures responding to personal insults. There was no violent confrontation. There was no public humiliation ceremony. There was only systematic institutional action that destroyed a wealthy man's business and forced his complete retreat from the neighborhood, leaving him financially diminished and professionally defeated. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that protecting family dignity required systematic responses rather than impulsive retaliation, that disrespect in public required public demonstrations of consequences, that institutional leverage was more devastating than violence, that coordination across multiple sectors created overwhelming pressure, that sustained effort over time produced comprehensive victories, and that real power was measured not by dramatic gestures, but by whether the person who showed disrespect was reduced to begging for terms, whether their business was destroyed, whether they were forced to retreat in defeat, whether precedents were established that deterred future violations, and whether dignity was defended through means that strengthened community institutions and created lasting change.